platform and very kind of cool process that you guys have sort of set up. The topic at hand we talked about a little bit enough with regards to software development, and that is sort of how do you advance in software development? Like how do you really advance in software development? Right? It's one thing for you to hear different companies talk about what their internal advancement policies are, and to sort of hear different, you know, platforms and different systems discuss what advancement looks like. But what does it actually look like? What does it actually consist of when you're doing this for 10 plus years, and you want to sort of get to a point where you're succeeding, you're achieving more and more, and sort of the defining lines between being say a junior developer, mid-level developer to actual senior developer in the industry itself, right? And yes. Go ahead. Oh, yes. Is that better? Oh, fantastic. So yeah, so essentially, what I want to discuss a little bit about with you guys is this idea of forward momentum in the software development field. How do you become a senior developer? How do you become a staff developer? How do you get to higher and higher levels of success in the industry? And what I will say, and I'll sort of start off with saying, is that the thing that I find has worked the best in my 10 plus years of doing this, since after post Marine Corps, post military time frame, is almost a Marine Corps like trait, in the sense that I've come to the conclusion over the years that the things that really make successful software developers is their inability to give up on a problem. And what I mean by that is you have, what we do for a living day in and day out is basically solve other people's problems. But beyond just solving other people's problems, we solve other people's problems that they themselves cannot solve. When a CEO hires you to be a software developer for his company, 9 times out of 10, that CEO does not know this skill set. He does, like they have problems that they want to solve. They have things that they want to do, but they don't have the skill sets that we have in the software development realm to solve their own problems in great respect. And so you are not just being hired to solve other people's problems. That's any job that's going down that route. But you are being hired to solve a particular set of problems that are very hard to solve, and that not very many people are willing or capable of solving on their own. And so, because of that, with that mindset in play, I sort of tend to tell junior engineers and mid-level folks and the like that really your job as a software developer is to solve problems that very few people can solve. And so your ability to not give up on a problem, your ability to continue until you have solved the problem at its very root cause, at its very root core, is the thing that is going to distinguish a good software engineer from a so-so software engineer, right? And a lot of people get into software engineering and then realize, okay, this isn't for them, and they move on to do other things. They move on to run product. They move on to do project management. And with the technical understanding in their background, they move on to do other stuff. But then there is the rare breed of software developer that just wants to code, just wants to work on projects that involve code. And running the project or running the team are secondary to actually wanting to solve a complicated issue. And so the sort of the big thing that I want to sort of address here is this idea that what allows you to grow in this industry ultimately comes down to your tenacity to not let go of a problem. And you see this a lot. You see this a lot with regards to good engineers. You see this a lot with regards to the difference between a junior engineer and, say, a senior engineer. In my mind, a lot of the differences between a junior to mid-level engineer is they still have something to prove. They still want to come off as accomplished. So they want to build a new feature to a new system, or they want to sort of prove themselves and prove their abilities in terms of, solving a complicated problem, and that's great. But they don't necessarily want the burnout that happens with trying to solve a complicated problem, right? Like they'll give up more easily than a senior engineer on a problem. Like they'll sort of throw their arms up in the air, so to speak, and that is the thing that you want to fight against when it comes to this job, when it comes to this industry. You want to fight against the idea that it can't be done, the idea that the problem that you're trying to solve can't be done, might not be possible. You might not have the skills or the abilities or the resources to do it. The joke in the industry that we usually give is that you can do anything in the software development industry if you have the ability, the money, and the time to do it. Right? Most people barely get 2 out of 3, let alone 1 out of 3 of that capacity. And so, ultimately, the big sort of thing that I want to kind of convey is this idea that whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve, whatever the issue is that you're trying to resolve, your inability to quit on that problem is ultimately the only thing that is going to allow you to actually accomplish that particular task. And the bigger the problem, the more intricate this becomes, right? Because you have more than just the technical problem to solve. We solve the technical problems. We're sort of told and pointed in a particular direction to try to solve the technical issues. But you have greater than just the technical issues to solve as a software engineer. You have to solve the adoption issue as well, right? Like one thing for you to just build something and it works and it's functional and you can show it. How do you actually get people to use it? How do you get actual people to adopt the thing that it is that you're building? And we generally tend to think that those issues and those problems are to be solved by us, that those problems are not within the technical realm, and thus, we can sort of leave those problems to be somebody else's problem. You've done your part. You've solved the technical. You've built the tool. You've built the app, and that sort of thing. And the reality is that failure of a software project almost always relates to all of those issues, all of those problems not being solved up front. So it doesn't matter how great the application might be that you're building. If you haven't tried, in your mind at least, to solve the adoption implementation issue, if you haven't tried to solve the scalability issue around how do you adopt users and bring on users to your platform, and if you think that is going to be somebody else's problem as a software developer, you're sadly mistaken, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what we build. If people aren't using it, then we've wasted our time. And so, those are the kinds of problems that you want to be able to solve. And those are the kind of problems that you don't want to give up on, especially if the problem that you're trying to solve is a worthwhile problem to solve. You want to think of those external problems as your problems. They're not just the project manager's problems. They're not just the product owner's problems. They are your problems by definition. And if you can solve them early enough within the process, you've sort of solved a lot of those problems for those people up front. Examples that I can give with regards to prior work and stuff like that are boundless on my end, from getting spreadsheets and drawings from groups like AFWorks, for example, on DoD projects, and having them basically tell us what we're going to build, and then being willing and able to push back on that and say, hey, look, like this might solve a limited subproblem, but nobody is going to use this tool unless it's actually usable, right? And then coming around and us promoting and pitching ideas such as building mapping tools over spreadsheets in order to give the users a better experience on mobile. Those sorts of things are kind of problems that we didn't need to solve. We didn't have to solve them up front. Those are the type of things that probably would have been just fine if we had just gone with the flow and done the thing that we were given and sort of tackled it in the way that we were told to tackle it. But that pushback, that willingness to push back and potentially be fired for pushing back on somebody else's idea are worth getting potentially fired for. So those ideas are worth pushing back against. If you think that there is a way to do it in such a way where you can basically allow, where the project benefits greatly from your willingness to think real world. To think what does a user actually utilize this application for in the real world, and does the implementation, does the thing that's been quote unquote told of me make sense to build? And so going back to what I was mentioning before with regards to the differences between a junior developer, mid-level developer, and senior developer. A senior developer has less to prove in their career, right? Like they have less that they need to sort of show from their perspective, and so they're more willing to push back on ideas, on concepts, on implementations. They're more willing to also get into the nitty gritty and give maybe some of the junior developers some of the cooler parts of the project, right? You're essentially, as you get into this industry, and as you go through this industry and you go higher up the chain in this industry, your people, the people that are building applications with you or for you, they're ultimately going to be the thing that are ultimately going to win the project, win the ability to succeed at whatever projects that you're building. They're going to be the ones that are going to make you look good. And so your willingness to let them look good in their retrospect, and be willing and capable of tackling, the hardest of bugs, like unless they want the bug, it's your job, it's your responsibility as you grow and as you get into a senior role, to sort of own that space, to sort of own and make sure that not just things are moving along as they should on a given project, and that people are delivering on what they said they're going to deliver on. But it is your responsibility to make sure that nobody feels overwhelmed with what they've been tasked with and what they've been doing. And if anyone is going to feel overwhelmed, it should be you. It should be you as the main person on the project, feeling overwhelmed, feeling the brunt of it. And I tell my guys all the time, until you see me look nervous, or I look nervous to you, keep at it. Just keep going. I'll figure out the problems that we haven't figured out yet. I'll deal with the issues that we haven't dealt with yet. And that's the kind of confidence that they need to be able to manage software engineers successfully. If they don't think that you're capable of solving any problem thrown at you from the particular issues that you're addressing, then they won't follow you into those deeper, darker issues that you have to address. And so, I'll end with sort of this idea that, if you want to be good at this job, if you want to succeed in this industry, if you want to make the big bucks, so to speak, and get the startup contracts or the startup jobs, or even the big government contracts, your unwillingness to give up on a problem is ultimately going to be the only thing that is going to stand between your succeeding on a project or succeeding on a particular problem and potentially the project's failing. And so be willing to not give up on whatever the problem is, whatever the subject is. There are no problems that are not solvable through technology, in my opinion. It's just our willingness to be creative in that sense. And that's all. That's it for my talk. Is there any questions? Well, it depends on your circumstance, obviously. I won't say that there isn't a situation where you eventually have to call it quits and move on. I mean, every time you leave a company, it's because you've felt that need, you felt that realization that, hey, there's no growth here, there's nothing for me here, and so I won't say that it won't ever happen. But ultimately, it really depends on the people, on the team that you're with. Is the team that you're working with, are those folks, are they, what is the overarching goal that you're trying to sort of help them with? And if that problem is worth solving, then yeah, you're going to want to give up. You're going to want to throw your hands up in the air. You're going to run into walls left and right. Everybody runs into that. But I find that I tend to give up less when I know that the people that I'm working with depend on me more. And that's really going to be, and so have you made yourself dependable to them in that retrospect, right? Like, are you indispensable to them and to the project? Are you tackling every major issue that gets thrown at you with the best regard, with your everything that you have, all of your ability, all of your, and if you are, then people are going to attempt to basically do the same for you, and you're going to see that. You're going to see it for right off the bat. So really, your ability to stay or not on a project is also going to be dependent on other people's willingness to not give up on you and not give up on the project as well. So go for it. Yep, go for it. Yeah. Well, so I started software development when I was in my early teens, 14 years old, 13, 14 years old, long time ago, back in the 90s. And I had no discipline whatsoever. And so, you know, came around 17, 18 years old, I realized, okay, well, I'm good at what I do. I can do this. I can do it I did it right out of high school, but I needed something else. And so for me, the Marine Corps was a break. I went to, this is circa 2001, and we all know what happened around from 2001 to 2009, essentially. And it was a decent break in the sense that I got to experience other things. I got to have other life experiences that sort of eventually led to a better me in the long run. But ultimately, once an officer finds out that you're better at computers than they are, you basically get stuck at a desk, and there's nothing you can do about it. Like once you type faster and you sort of understand computers better, there's no escaping it. Eventually it just comes and finds you. And so I eventually got out and finished my computer science degree, and have been doing this ever since. So my experience was probably a little different than most in this particular space. But what I will say is that I would not have changed that for anything, right? Like I'm a much better software developer now because of my military experience. Like I look at guys that I knew that were right out of high school, went to college, got their degrees, went to work for some of the bigger companies and stuff like that. And my drive to do things is night and day compared to theirs. And I mean in the positive, like where I am more driven in my mind a lot of times in what I'm doing and in the opportunities that I try to take advantage of than a lot of the guys that I grew up with, a lot of the guys that I went to high school with. And I think a lot of that comes down to military training. So, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I had a question. Um, Vital, I'm Army dude. I was wondering if you knew of any veteran communities that are building Web3 stuff, working on Web3 projects, as a group. Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, sorry. So yeah, what, if any, do you know of any groups that are working on Web3 stuff, veterans specifically, building any cool projects or anything like that?
I know a lot of groups in the Web3 space that are working on different projects right now. In fact, I'm supposed to give a talk on the 11th about new projects, specifically smart contract projects that are interesting. I have a series of talks I gave last year around sometime between November, December to January timeframe on Web3 from a technical perspective, right? Like what is the nature of smart contracts to CTOs and stuff like that. There's a podcast called Seven CTOs that if you want to look it up on Spotify, you'll see a couple of episodes that I did on there with regards to Web3 back in January, November, December, January timeframe. And so what I will say is I don't know any veteran specific groups, but one of the things that is really interesting about the Web3 space is it ebbs and flows, right? Like you have really interesting projects, you have really interesting stuff that sort of shines. But what I would recommend is, and I have a couple of developer groups that I can send to Jamil later on, and he can share with you guys. But what I would recommend is start a veteran group in that space if you're looking for veterans that are doing similar things in that sense. What I find most of the time in my experience is that most of the things that I want to get into, not many veterans are doing. And this has been true for the last decade, right? Like a decade ago, what we're doing here, the conversation that we're having here with other veterans didn't exist. Like, I literally was the only veteran in my entire computer science class. I was the only veteran working at SPAWAR on a project of 25 engineers. When I was at the Department of Veterans Affairs and we were running developer.va.gov, I was the only veteran working there. And so I find that for us, at the very least, you should go out and find the communities that you want to be a part of. Tell me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you'll be in a year, right? So if you want to be in the Web3 space, if you want to be working in that space, go find folks that are working in that space and be the first with those folks working in that with those folks, and then bring in other veterans that have that interest. But I tend to find less of this sort of stuff with regards to veterans already being in the areas that I'm trying to get into. And so I would recommend digging into the Web3 space more. And then if you find that there's a need there, and there should be more veterans in that space, bring them on board, find them and bring them online. But I don't generally tend to find a lot of veterans groups focused on the highly technical, highly complex ecosystems like that, right? Right now, most of my day-to-day is writing code that writes code, right? And that's extremely complicated to where you have to design code that knows how to write it properly, syntax properly, good code in and of itself. And so there's not many people that I've met in that particular space, let alone veterans in that particular space. So I highly recommend finding those spaces first, and then bringing veterans that and getting them excited about it, getting them interested in that venue. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Make sure you send that list to Jamil. I'm really interested in meeting more people. It's like, now that I understand a little bit more, it's like, all right, what are other people doing?
Yep. And really, like, the thing that's cool about the Web3 space is, it is a paradigm shift when it comes to software development, right? This idea that you're writing your application once and then you're deploying it, and it's never changing ever again, right? That's a fundamental paradigm shift for how we write software and for how we get software deployed and into production. And so there's a lot there that it's one of the reasons I did those episodes around smart contracts and how all that stuff works is to sort of shine a light for folks that have wanted to get into the space, how different software development is going to be for them in that space versus what they do day to day, or in regular application development and stuff like that. And it really is confusing for some people because of the nature of the fact that it's immutable. You can't change it once you deploy it. So you really have to think about what you're doing. You really have to think about your strategy up front. And you really have to debug and do all of your sort of stuff ahead of time before you actually get any code out for people to use.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Looking forward to presenting our project about this stuff. So, yeah.
Sounds good. Any other questions?
No, I don't have any questions. I was just kind of hanging out and just enjoying the talk and the discussion.
Very cool platform you guys have here. This is interesting.
Thank you.
No, I'm good. I'm also enjoying the talk, just listening. Thank you, though.
Yeah, I'm good. I appreciate you taking the time, Michael. Maybe a quick one. What
Go
would be
for it.
another good key as we are becoming new? I'm just rebrushing over learning code myself. I used to learn as a kid, and I didn't realize what I was doing. And then I ended up as
Yeah.
well in the military, and then I did a career that turned from 4 to 20. So, what would be a key to pass along? I heard your don't give up, but what would be kind of your top, if you would say?
Uh, get really good at JavaScript because everything else depends on it. I mean, that's just the truth. Like even from web frameworks to backend systems, if you get really good at JavaScript, all of the languages, software development is one of those things that, what to be a real good polyglot, every language functions the same. Once you understand one at a fundamental level, everything else becomes relatively easy to do. I learned Perl initially as my first language when I was a kid, and that sort of that brutal language sort of helped me with everything else. And so, learn JavaScript, learn TypeScript, be familiar with those languages and those systems, and get really good at them. And then ultimately, doesn't matter what other language you end up needing to work in or needing to do in the future. Understanding those fundamentals is just going to make you a better developer in any language that you end up doing. Project that I'm on right now, we're looking at potentially writing, in every language imaginable, and you can only imagine how difficult that is from a purely syntactical perspective, right? And so like you don't have to do that with every project. Obviously, you can focus on a handful of languages that you can get really good at, but get really good at least one. Like focus really well on at least one or two that is your language, that is your thing, and then everything else that you build is going to be relatively easy by comparison. Once you understand fundamentally, a language at its comparative minimum. If JavaScript isn't for you guys or TypeScript isn't for you guys, go Ruby. List-based languages tend to be easier to learn. I love that the Ruby language personally. I would write it all day long if I didn't get paid really well to do other languages. But yeah, just focus on something that you can master first, and then extrapolate from there.
Thank you.
I'll ask a question too. I was being shy, but I have a question. I'm a junior developer, and I'm working on my first big project. It's a React Native application, and I've kind of been put in a situation where I'm building it on my own. And so, going back to the never giving up attitude, that's great, and I have that. And I don't ever give up, but something that happens, which I hope you might have some tips for me, is I will like look for the answer and try to figure it out, and sometimes time just escapes me, and I can work on something for like 2 weeks, just not giving up, when maybe I should have taken a step back and like really, maybe rethought my approach or something like that. So I don't know if you have any tips on knowing when to give up and like go look for in a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. There is such a thing as the sunk cost fallacy, right? This idea that like I've put so much time and energy into something that I shouldn't. That it is a fallacy to think that you shouldn't give up on it, right? Like sunk cost fallacy says that like I've sunk in so much of my time, energy, and effort into this thing that I cannot, for the life of me, give up on it. And I think giving up, actually giving up on, like purposefully giving up on something, really just comes down to looking at the cost benefit of it, right? Like at the end of the day, we and you'll realize this as you go through and as you go get into other projects. Some projects just become extremely unwieldy, right? And a lot of those projects, when they become extremely unwieldy, it's due to a lack of best practices, right? Like you at the beginning of the project, you didn't implement testing, and so as you make changes, you don't know whether your changes are going to properly break the platform in a negative way, or whether or not you're going to, not going to know what's breaking because you don't have tests, or CI/CD or any of that.
Oh, I think it just cut off at CI/CD.
Like you don't know.
Hey, brother, you cut off a little bit.
Yeah, it's cutting off.
Oh,
sorry about
Can
that.
you hear me?
It's choppy. I heard that part, but I didn't hear. We were talking about best practices and how how you want to implement those from the beginning and testing.
Exactly. So the thing that generally tends to cause people to give up on a project or give up on stuff is they didn't really do best practices up front. And so that maybe they just got excited about the project, and so they started building. They didn't take tests into consideration. They didn't add CI/CD at the start of a project, right? And all those things are ultimately going to be. There's this concept that everybody understands of technical debt, but nobody ever really talks about the concept of technical assets. Just like you can accrue technical debt during a project, as the project gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You should be looking towards the idea of accumulating technical assets. What's a technical asset? Well, technical asset is the opposite of debt, right? It's the things that are going to make your project better, faster, help you move faster in the long run. That's testing. That's proper CI/CD management. That's all automated deployability of your project and stuff like that. Those things are going to ultimately pay off in the long run if you're willing to pay the price for those things up front. And so you're less likely to give up on a project if it has those things, if you've invested assets into that project ahead of time, and you're not just looking to build and build and build and build without any checks and balances on your part or on the part of the other developers on the team, if that makes sense. So any project I start, very first thing I do is implement a testing strategy. Very first thing I do is implement CI/CD. If I go into a project and it doesn't have it, that's the very first thing I'm working on. Forget other features, forget other functionality that's necessary or that has been requested of me. Those are the things that I'm going to do first, because those are the things that are going to determine that I'm not breaking somebody else's past work in a negative way or adding to the technical debt that the project already has. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that's really good advice. Thank you very much.
I have a question. In your experience, what between working with veterans or just other folks, service members, and civilians, are there any like leadership styles or differences? Like, can you say a little bit about some of the distinctions on how you've what you've learned, through your experiences and things that carried over well?
I unfortunately have not had the opportunity to work with too many veterans since in the last 10 years. So I tend to be the only veteran in the projects that I'm working on, and I would say that I tend to take over projects, and that's probably something to attribute to my time as a Marine, right? Like I like to say that I'm either in charge or I know who is. And that's a very important aspect of it, right? Because a lot of projects will attempt to sort of do this, pseudo leadership. Everybody's in charge. Nobody's really in charge. Everybody's in charge. At the end of the day, somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to be. You have to be willing to step on that landmine, so to speak, and put yourself in a position of being in charge if you want the project to succeed. If you want the project to move forward and do well. And so that's from my experience, like that's the best kind of leadership for any project is your willingness to take ownership, to take leadership, and be willing to fail. Projects that I've been on have failed, and I was the ultimate, the last person that sort of you could blame for something like that, and I had to be willing to accept that, and that forced me to sort of learn never to go through that again, right? Like never will I allow a project to fail that I've sort of taken ownership of and taken over. But those are the type of things that you sort of have to do. Now, in terms of working with other veterans, what I will say is, I think I have worked with one or two, and I don't know if it's necessarily the nature of those individuals, but it's beneficial. Like you miss it. You miss working with people that you can just sort of tell them something and they know how to do it. But I will say that you will find that in the civilian world as well. You will find people that aren't veterans, but that are highly disciplined, and you just have to say something in their general direction, and they know exactly what you're talking about, and they're willing and able to execute on it right away. There's guys that I've met that I've joked with them. It's like, hey, you would have made a great Marine back in the day if you had joined, right? And so I think it's more about personalities and the personalities that you surround yourself with, or that your company or that your organization sort of finds and puts into position. That's why like most of my time is spent in hiring and doing code reviews. Half my time is spent doing code reviews and doing interviews for my company. And a lot of that has to do with just the fact that I know what the cost is of a bad hire versus a good hire. And so you want the best of the best folks that you can put into those positions. And sometimes you're going to find great folks. Sometimes you're not, and you have to be willing to be very selective in that sense. If you get put in that position.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing what you guys build. You guys take care. God bless. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.